Welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. The Whitetail Rut can have its ups and downs, and this year from a Rut-Cation is no exception. All right, welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. Thank you as always for joining in and listening. So this episode is going to be basically an update of my Rut-Cation, basically an update on my hunts through the rut so far. Now, I've kind of taken a bit of a timeout for the rest of the weekend because I have to start up work here starting tonight, essentially. So, but I just wanted to do a breakdown of my hunts going through basically from the start of November till now. It's one of those things where, I kind of jumped around a little bit to the beginning of November and then really put my focus into the, my, private piece that I hunt where I do all my food plot work and habitat work. So I wanted to break that down of how those hunts went and kind of what I kind of learned along the process. But before we get into that, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share the show with your friends. If you want to see the full collection of all the content available, head on over to mihuntingpodcast.com. And while you're there, become a member. Your membership supports this show directly and grants you special access to members-only content, giveaways, and discounts. But let's get into the topic at hand. So basically, my primary focus for at least that first full week of November, or at least basically the few days surrounding November 7th. So in years past of running cameras on the farm that I hunt, I've noticed that a particular buck would always show up. He was really consistent about he would make an appearance on Halloween night, and then 7 days later, on November 7th, make a reappearance during daylight on the property as well. So I started keying in on that last year. My goal was to hunt the 7th. Long story short, I ended up getting out of the stand partway through the day. And of course, an hour later, he comes through and made an appearance on one of my cameras. So it was daylighted on the property. So this year, my primary focus, basically my entire span of the time available I had to be able to take off of work, was to focus on the farm and to try to capitalize on this buck with his historic movement. So basically my focus was essentially from the 5th up to basically up until rifle season as to how long it took for me to catch up with this deer. So I did have a couple days before I really wanted to put my focus on the farm. I didn't want to jump the gun and be there too soon and start burning out some of those stands, start allowing some of those deer feel my, the hunting pressure. They want to start bumping does, too much and making them uncomfortable to where they weren't having that natural movement that could, basically start pushing them off the property or something like that. So I wanted to wait a few days. I'd say we got closer to that November 7th window. Ultimately, if you listen to the last episode where I had did some scouting and bumped a couple bucks on some public land where I basically was set up in a transition area or a little travel funnel or travel corridor, I guess you could say. And I had pushed up into what I thought was the bedding area, did bump a couple of bucks out of there. So I did go up in there. I don't remember exactly what day it was. It was either the first or the second. I think it must have been the second or third, somewhere in there. And so I pushed up into that area. It was not an easy go. Basically this bedding is up on top of this big hill. Getting up there in the dark, it took me actually a good 20 minutes to get up this hill to where I wasn't making too much noise, wasn't getting too winded, wasn't getting too sweaty to where I was going to run into an issue once I made it to the top, either, basically being, soaking wet from sweat and running the issue of where, I wasn't staying warm or whatnot. So I plan on sitting for quite a while if need be. So I pushed up on top of this hill and basically having a southwest wind basically came from the northeast side, basically allowing the wind to blow into my face. Once I got up to the top, I had scouted this spot slightly, but I didn't have, exact spot that I wanted to set up in, or, an exact plan as to, the spot that I was going to sit. Now, I did know that I didn't want to take my saddle up there. A lot of the trees that were up there, they were mature trees, but the problem is that a lot of them are very mature timber where they were very crowded at one point. So they don't have very many branches going up, but they have a big canopy on top. So I knew that if I were to try this up in a tree, you would basically be, this big blob on the side of this tree. Didn't have any side cover or brush cover or branches, anything like that to hide me in that tree. And being up in that area and not knowing exactly how deer maneuvered in there, I didn't know, if I set up on the wrong side of a tree or how much, deer would be moving around up there to where I wasn't comfortable being able to hide up in the tree there. So I went for a ground setup because knowing there's a bunch of deadfalls in there, basically set up in one of those deadfalls or in a pocket of deadfalls, use it as ground cover, and just hunt from the ground. So snuck up in there. I ended up setting up about 30 yards from what I thought was maybe where the bedding area was, or not necessarily truly bedding because it is kind of still open a little bit, but did have some beech tree saplings in there that kind of thickened it up, where I knew that that's where the deer were when I saw them the first time. So set up about 30 yards from there, thinking that maybe if the deer are milling around in there or, work around that cover area, that they would be within bow range. So sat up in there, got up in there probably a good 20 minutes before, really first light or just started getting that gray light. Being up on top of this hill, I didn't know how much the wind was going to swirl around or whatnot. So I actually laid out some Evercalm, some VS1, and then also some buck scent. Basically just kind of make the area smell like there's plenty of deer within the area and hide my scent as best as possible. I know you're not really going to beat a deer's nose, but again, if it buys me a second or two to be able to either draw or make a move on a deer, I was going to utilize that best I could. So I'm sitting up in there, and it's just getting about the first few minutes after first shooting light, and I start to hear what sounds like a deer approaching. So kind of peek out from my little ground bind area where I had kind of one side open, expecting that's where some of the deer movement would be. And lo and behold, this deer crests this little tiny knoll that's about 10 yards, to my left. And this buck pops his head out and is walking straight at me. So at this point, I'm able to grab onto my bow, but I can't do much about anything else because he's still walking straight at me. And he just keeps coming and coming and coming. And again, he's within 10 yards of me now and notices this little dark blob sitting in the midst of this deadfall. He, sees me there and then, basically does that little head bob bit and then spooks a little bit. So clearly, the fact that he came in, coming right at me, he noticed me sitting there because, again, that was the one area that I had left open, thinking that if a deer was going to come through, it'd actually come from the opposite direction. It would pass by, and then I would have a nice clear opening to be able to shoot from. This deer came from the exact opposite direction and caught me off guard. So he did spook off a little bit. Again, it was one of those things where he didn't like what he saw, but he didn't know exactly what it was. So real quick, grab my doe bleat call, hit him a couple of doe bleats. He ended up, from there, kind of stalling a little bit, but ultimately he did eventually start to move off a little bit. I thought maybe if he couldn't figure it out, he might circle around and try to come from another approach. About 5 minutes later, it appears as though that's what had happened, as he basically looked like the same deer had come down and circled back around. The problem is that he still knew that there was something in, that deadfall. So he definitely had his eye on there. And from there, he basically had it pegged where it wasn't a deer that was in that deadfall. There was something else that he didn't like. So he did spook off a second time. So ultimately, my plan worked in the essence that, I knew at least my call on the fact that the deer was going to be up in there and within that little corner of the top of the hill, I was spot on in that regard. My execution on my setup and being prepared for the deer, that's where I failed. Ultimately, I think the biggest thing is that the moment I started hearing the deer come and knew that it was close, I should have grabbed my bow. I should have turned and been ready, because at that point, as soon as I saw that it was a buck, I could have been drawn on him as he crested the hill, and could have potentially gotten a pretty easy shot. Even if it was a frontal shot, at that distance, I had taken a shot like that on a doe that was, of course, injured, but that was all the way up to 30 yards. So 10 yards with a frontal shot, I felt like if I had been prepared or been ready for that, that's something I could have easily accomplished. So the other thing is that, looking back at it again, looking at the mistakes I made, I should have known by the sound of how the deer walked. Essentially, if you spent any time in the woods, hunting whitetails, especially, like, you can kind of tell the difference between what sounds like a doe walking and a buck. Those bucks just kind of have a different cadence to their walk. They almost kind of like they're a little bit more sluggish. They kind of slam their feet down a little bit more. They kind of drag a little bit. It just sounds different. I don't know how else really to explain it much better, but it's kind of one of those things that you can kind of tell the difference. A doe kind of seems like they kind of tiptoe a little bit, unless of course they get spooked or run or something like that. But ultimately, a doe does sound different, typically going through the woods, than a buck does. So I should have recognized the sound of the walk and been much more prepared. So it's one of those things like, yeah, I could have been, patient and, waited on, visualizing the deer or seeing the deer before I made a decision. But knowing this, how close that was going to be, should have hurried up and been prepared for that deer to be in my face, essentially. So that deer spooked out and sat for a couple more hours. Didn't see anything else that came through. So ultimately decided I was going to do basically a little bit more scouting. Worked my way around, basically around the whole edge of that hill, or the top of that hill, to try to get a little bit better lay of the land, see how some of the rest of the landscape laid out, and then made my way down, checked the camera that was at the base of the hill, and I do believe that buck that I had spooked was on the camera, a day or two before that, down at the base of the hill. So it did look like it was him, and he was still in the area. The bigger buck that I had on camera, as well as the one I believe I saw up on top, he hasn't shown up again on camera, or at least when I last checked. So I'm not sure if he's still around or if what he's doing, really. So at some point, I'm going to go back and check that camera again. Now that it's been basically a week's time since I've been down there. That is still an area that I'm very interested in for hunting for the next several seasons, unless I find something a little bit better. And then I went back, did one last shot at some state land that's by my house. Again, going after that wider 8-point that I had a couple encounters with before, or I guess during the pre-rut phase. Ultimately ended up seeing a spike and then a smaller buck, and that was it for the morning. So, kind of a bit of letdown there, but I wanted to get one last shot at that location. I do think that in that spot, the number of times I'd hunted and the number of times that especially that deer had, either full on busted me or been nervous about what was in the area. I do think I might have overhunted that location a bit. Basically, left a little bit too much ground scent, left a little bit too much of, human presence in that area that, again, that's where I think that those deer feel comfortable, because there's not a lot of human presence, and the fact that I was back there as much as I was started to change that a bit. And then we get to Sunday the 5th, and that's when I really wanted to start my focus on the farm and put basically all my eggs in one basket and hunt that until I either got my deer or until rifle season, when basically the gloves get to come off, reach out and get these deer from a much further distance. So on the very first morning, essentially sitting on, or I guess the first two sits I was planning on doing more or less kind of a observation sit, but still be in areas where I know that deer travel. And even one stand where I had killed a buck a few years back. So set up on this basic inside corner of the main top field. And basically the two things I was really looking at is there was a cut cornfield that had been cut a few weeks ago that still has some scraps of corn in there that a lot of the does are feeding on. So catch some of the movement coming back from that, as well as there's a bit of like a valley that cuts through that field that basically attaches the one property to the other. So it's a way for the deer to be able to cross without having to go all the way down around into the creek bottom to make it over to the other properties. They can cut through the low point of the field and then make it into the hardwoods and on to the next property if that's where they're trying to go, is basically cut across. So that morning was pretty slow as well. Did get I don't know, it was a younger deer. I don't know if it was just a big fawn or a 1.5-year-old doe, but it was kind of milling up around the corn, would eat out into the field that had been plowed probably during the early part of October. So there's a lot of that fresh greenery, fresh grasses coming up. And then from there, it was pretty slow. There was one other deer that showed up basically on the property line that eventually the deer that was up by the corn moved down towards, and basically they moved off. Didn't see anything for another couple hours. Basically it was about 10 o'clock and this lone doe comes out of the wood line on the property line, cuts into the field, and then basically kind of hastily went across the field into the hardwoods. She did kind of do that, like stop and look back a couple times. So I thought maybe there was a buck behind her that had pushed her out of her bed or had pushed her out of the that patch of timber and what's pushed her across the field. Sure enough, about 40 minutes later, one of my target bucks is basically on her trail, not really running after her, but definitely following the same path that she came down. So at this point I grabbed my doe bleat again, hit the doe bleat. He picks his head up, but then kind of kept milling around. He definitely had his head down, sniffing the ground, definitely looking for just using his nose to track these does that are have gone across the field and whatnot. He kept kind of milling around a little bit. He kept kind of making turns like he was going to head my direction, then he would turn like he was heading across the field, turn back to me. So it was kind of nerve-wracking going through that, where it was kind of like, oh, he's coming my way, no he's not. Oh, he is going to come my way, no he's not. Ultimately he kind of did like a big shape or semicircle where he kind of cut through. He actually didn't even really follow all the way behind that doe. He followed her for a little bit, but then he broke off and headed basically she went due west and he ended up turning south. I'm sorry. He ended up turning north and headed north into the creek bottom from there. While he was making his travels too, I did grunt at him a couple of times. He, again, same thing. He picked his head up, but he really didn't seem interested or was not phased at all by my calling. So that was very encouraging seeing him, show up, cruising on the very first hunt. So I sat the whole rest of the day there, basically not really seeing much of else. So then we head into the second day. So second day, again, kind of the same thing. The same plan was to do a bit of an observation hunt and kind of more or less, instead of watching the top field this time, I was going to watch the bottom field, kind of watch the food plot. So I snuck through down the one property line to a stand that overlooks my food plot, but is also in back into the creek bottom a little bit, so I can shoot more so in the creek bottom than I can into the food plot. Now on this day too, there was some rain coming in, so it was kind of being one of those things where as long as the rain wasn't too heavy, there's going to be still plenty of deer movement. So, as I'm sitting in a tree stand, I noticing that there's, and watching the radar, there's a lot more severe storm coming than what was originally anticipated. So I kind of quickly climbed down out of the tree stand, went over to the hunting blind to kind of wait out the storm a little bit. Not long after being in the blind, there was essentially another good buck, I'll say. He's not necessarily one of the ones I would, at that point, especially be considered one of my shooters. But he is, I think, probably a 3-year-old. He's kind of got the same typical look of a lot of the bucks that are down in that area. They kind of have a pretty uniform 8-point. He's actually a little 9-pointer. He's got a little extra point on his left side. He came through basically from the north, from the adjacent property, heading in my direction. The problem was we had a pretty stiff wind out of the south, so I'm pretty sure that he either had caught wind of me or picked up on scent of a doe that had gone through probably about 20 minutes beforehand. So, because he basically took the same path that she did, so I don't know which one it was, if he ultimately spooked, or if he just caught her scent and was chasing after where she had gone. Waited out the rain, and then once the rain stopped, probably about mid-morning, headed back to the tree stand, sat the rest of the day. From there, not too much action until about the last hour of light. Several does came out with their fawns. Did end up watching a pretty good interaction with a 1.5-year 5-pointer. A couple of fawns were back in the creek bottom, kind of milling around, feeding and whatnot. And this guy came through, came in grunting and came up, hit the scrape, and then basically turned his attention to that doe fawn. So he kind of ran her off. The button buck twin that's with her, he basically started following that buck around. Ultimately, he circled around, headed back out to the food plot, and at that point, essentially chased off all the remaining does and fawns. So at that point, decided to get down for the night, seeing as how he just cleared the field, basically with only about 10 minutes of light left anyway. So both those observations, look promising. Seeing, basically a mature buck on both days was a good start, or at least I thought anyways. And, I thought that things were only going to get better from there to come. So now we're on to November 7th. And, this is when I'm really anticipating that buck to show up on the property again. He's shown up 2 years in a row on the 7th. I'm expecting him, there again. End up sitting into basically on the other side of the property this time, sitting in some hardwoods that is above main creek bottom, a cover that I cut out and killed a bunch of the honeysuckle earlier this year. And it's just down the hill from the corn. So basically you got the food, cover, and that's still part of that travel corridor of that low point of the top field that leads into these hardwoods. So basically a travel corridor, a cruising route, you got food source and cover, and it's proven itself to be a consistent area where deer like to move. Ultimately on that day I didn't really see much until there was some, I think I had like a spike come through, nothing really exciting. It wasn't until the evening hunt that I did see a little bit better movement. Had a doe come through heading up to the corn, and then had a basically a little forky follow her. He put on a pretty good show of grunting his head off and following her up the hill, essentially about 5 minutes behind her. I could see him back in the cover before he got on her track, where he's kind of snooping around, and then you could tell the moment that he hit her track, he started following it basically on a string. So was one of those things where I was a little disappointed that I didn't see the buck that I was targeting. But again, it was one of those things that I was sitting in one spot. I only had so much of an area to watch. So he might have been a different, section of the property, and I just missed. Move on to the next day. I'm sitting in the same stand. Basically the conditions are still pretty good for that area. We are getting a little bit more of a light rain that day, which puts us at November 8th at this point. And at this point, I can see, we're looking at about 9 a.m. Again, not too much movement up until this point. I'm not sure if it was the rain that kind of suppress some of the movement or not. But as I'm sitting there off in the distance on the adjacent property, I can see a buck up on the hilltop. So at this point, I'm not sure the likelihood of how far he's going to come over to me, if he's going to come over or not. There was a doe with him, so I knew that he was locked down with that doe. And it was one of those things where I had to basically change my mindset of I'm not really hunting him anymore. I'm hunting what that doe is going to do, or have to anticipate what that doe is going to do. And based on where she was at, on that property, essentially, there's a patch of pines that are just up the hill from where she was feeding. So I figured that she was probably going to head up into those pines instead of coming down and crossing the property line. So I pushed closer to the property line, and in anticipation that if she did come across the line, that he would follow. Ultimately, I think as I made my approach, that the buck spotted me because he was up higher on the hill, and I did a couple of grunts at him to basically just kind of pretend like I don't know, pretend that was another deer, coming closer and whatnot. Ultimately, he did kind of spook out, so I'm not sure if it was that he saw my movement or heard me, or what the deal was, but he did end up taking off. Now the doe, she kind of stayed put where she was at, so I figured that he would be back if as long as she doesn't take off, then he's probably gonna make it a reappearance. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, he came back. Kind of the same thing. At this point, repositioned myself where I thought the wind might be a little bit better, where if he tried circling down, that he would basically circle down into me. Again, did a couple of grunts, and he actually started making his way to me. He kind of hangs up again. Now at this point, I can kind of see him if I really kind of peek myself up, as I'm kind of down lower into some cover. So, just trying to feel this deer out a little bit, I end up doing a snort wheeze at him, and he still continued to start to come. He gets to the edge of the cover and hangs up a little bit again. So, thinking, well, he came in this far. Let's see if we can push him a little bit further. Gave a couple of grunts, and I took my hand and kind of like pawed at the ground and the leaves and grass and whatnot, basically making it sound like I'm just another buck, doing an impromptu scrape real quick. The moment I did that, this buck turns and takes off back up the hill and into the pines. Ultimately, apparently that was a little too aggressive for him. He was, I guess, a die easy lover, where he, again, I don't know if it was the fact that he either saw me, or the fact that he couldn't see another deer or another buck that was making that noise that made him ultimately nervous. But he ended up taking off. The doe herself, she stuck around for a good another 20-30 minutes, just feeding around, milling around. She eventually did kind of see me a little bit. She kind of bobbed or walked back and forth trying to figure out what I was. But ultimately, I guess, I don't know, she thought maybe I was another deer and just wasn't coming over, or what the deal was. But she eventually just kind of milled her up, way back up to the pines. And then that was it for that hunt. At this point, I'm already down at the stand. I had that interaction with that buck that ultimately I didn't feel like he was going to be making his way toward me anytime soon. And at this point, it started raining pretty good, so I figured, go ahead and take a break, head home, let the clothes dry and whatnot. Made it home, letting the clothes dry out, resting, and next thing I know, I end up with a 24-hour, stomach bug, and not able to go out hunting for another day and a half. So, that basically put me out of commission for, the evening hunt for the 8th. I wasn't able to hunt the 9th at all, and I wasn't able to go back until the 10th. At this point, we're at November 10th now. I figure, like, all right, well, I had a couple days to rest up, start to feel better, and, maybe just, the lack of my presence there would give those deer, let things simmer down maybe a little bit. So from there, I end up going back to the same stand again, which this was a really good morning. It ended up being, more or less calm in the morning, but a nice heavy frost on the ground. And even when I was packing up the vehicle, getting ready, it just felt like it was the right day to be out. End up seeing 2 bucks crossing the road, out chasing does. So again, another good sign that there's deer definitely out cruising. They're out chasing. Deer are definitely moving around. So get set up, and I guess I'm going to talk about real quick about my approach into the to the stand. So again, the way that the layout, there's a big cut cornfield, about 10 acres. Still more open field off to the right of that. It's about, I think it's a good 40 acres of this open, recently plowed field where there's some grasses in it, but it's only like ankle high. So it's basically a wide open field. And the hardwoods are to the north of that cornfield. So I basically have to either walk down one property line next to the cornfield to get to that stand, or either cut through the field and then take, make an L motion into the hardwoods to get to the stand, or have to loop all the way around along the edge of the other property line, along the creek bottom to the north, and then end up cutting in. So what I decided to do was, again, it's very difficult to make it through this wide open field without really being noticed. But I figured there's a low enough point, it's downhill just enough from the corn that as long as I'm not making too much noise and I don't use my big white spotlight or headlamp, that maybe I can sneak down there. Or even if a deer does hear me or see a little bit of movement, they just think maybe it's just another deer moving around down below. As long as I don't get right on top of these deer, that I won't spook them too much. And that seems to be a pretty successful tactic. Now, I had a deer that must have been bedded in the field, just resting, hanging out after probably feeding. Because at some point, about when I was about halfway across the field, I did hear this deer stand up and kind of jump up and then take off towards the corn. So I did end up spooking one deer, but it wasn't necessarily it wasn't one of those cases where they spook and just blow and blow and blow and blow and I'll announce to the world that something's not right. So I was able to basically loop down. Once I was down, basically parallel with the stand I wanted to, or perpendicular to the stand I wanted to be in, I hung a left, headed in, basically got set up in the stand essentially. While I'm doing that, again, another good sign that you're able to sneak in and make not too much noise. Once I was in the tree stand, I could hear, as a deer, through the cover, a deer approaching. Now I could kind of make out the silhouette of the body of the deer, but I couldn't tell much of else other than, again, it sounded like a buck that came in and was investigating, because ultimately I could see that it kind of had his nose down, was kind of sniffing around. Ultimately, it moved on and went back into the cover. So that was another good sign of being able to sneak in, and the fact that these deer were, again, kind of up and moving around a little bit. As we get closer into daylight, I could see out in the field a single deer heading up towards the corn. Again, just by its body language, it appeared to be a buck. At this point, I could put the binoculars on it as the sun was, that light from the sun coming up was starting to shine onto the field a little bit, so I could make out more of the body of the deer. I didn't see a significant rack on it, so if it was a buck, it was a small one. Ultimately, watch it go all the way up to the edge of the cornfield. I could see it on the edge of the hardwoods, basically snooping, doing this little sniffing around and exploring up there on top of the corn. So at this point, I figured, well, you know what? That deer's going to have to come out of that cornfield at some point. So he's either going to cut across the field or come back down to these hardwoods. Sure enough, probably about 5-10 minutes later, I hear behind me what sounds like a deer walking. Peek over my shoulder. Here comes basically a little spike horn coming down the hill. I'm assuming that was the buck or the deer that was seen about 5 minutes before, heading up to the corn there. As this deer comes down, he's basically kind of kitty corning, basically kind of right where I was hoping he'd come down. Came down to about 20 yards. He stopped at my ground scent, stopped, and at this point he kind of spooks a little bit, turns around, and is looking up the hill. And then what I hear, what sounds like another deer coming down the hill. So sure enough, peek around the tree again, and here comes not one of the big bucks I'm after, but certainly one that I'm willing to shoot. He's probably be number 3 or number 4 on the old shooter buck list, and he's coming down the hill towards me. So at this point, I grab my bow and I'm getting ready. As he's coming down the hill, that spike goes up to him, starts messing with him. Spike's jumping around him and whatnot. I'm just like, all right, well, don't ruin this for me here. Just let him come down the rest of the hill. Let him follow the same path that you did, and then I'll get a nice easy shot on him. He comes down and gets about 38 yards and stand there broadside after I'd ranged him. And at this point, I'm about to draw on him, but then he starts to walk, and he's still kind of kitty-cornering. He starts kitty-cornering down towards me. So at this point, I said, all right, hold off. He's going to get closer to me yet. I'm not going to complain about a closer shot. As he gets down closer, he gets to about 35 yards. Again, this is kind of more open timber in the kind of direction where he's coming from. I range again to double check, make sure. Yep, 35 yards. Set my pin. As I'm about to prepare myself to draw, after setting the pin, I hear that spike horn blow, and they both kind of scatter, and he jumps and heads out of range, and that spike heads up the hill. So at this point, again, just kind of, I'm just a little rattled the fact that I had this deer right here at 35 yards, just about to draw on him, and it's been blown again. So at this point, again, I'm thinking maybe he doesn't quite understand what that spike was blowing at. So I grab the doe bleat, hit the doe bleat. He looks back. Ultimately, the spike ends up seeing a doe that was making her way across the main field. He starts heading off in that direction, and then the bigger buck ends up following that doe again. So, again, another missed opportunity for me where, again, I don't know what else really I could do other than the fact that I just need to make sure that a couple things, I guess I'll say. One, like, I know that I just kind of got hung up on that bigger buck and kind of not necessarily forgot about the spike, but kind of disregarded him. And so I'm assuming what happened was that spike caught that movement of me ranging that other deer and setting my pin, that he saw the movement and had me pegged, and eventually he had enough of it and he spooked, and that's what spooked the other deer. So the hard lesson is, don't forget about the other deer that are in the area. Even though, that was a young buck, he still was wise enough to catch me. So again, not forgetting about the other deer that are in the area. Keep a kind of a side eye on them. Make sure that they're don't have you pegged when you go to make movements or whatnot. The other one is, so I've been trying to tell myself this season, especially with some of these older bucks I've been trying to go after, is that not to rush. Don't hurry yourself. Don't be acting frantic or anything like that. Don't be making any quick movements or excessive movements or anything like that you have more time than what you think. So ultimately, when I had that buck at 38 yards, I probably should have just gone ahead and drawn on him and taken a shot with him being distracted by the other buck and standing broadside. That was more than an ample opportunity where I could have drawn back on him and gotten a shot off. Ultimately, trying to be patient, I think might have burned me a little bit in that regard of, it's like, yeah, be patient, but then take the shots that are given to you, essentially. I don't know. It's one of those things that is probably going to be something I'll think about until next season, even, of something that's to keep in mind of just another, experience to put in your memory bank of things, to do things better. The rest of the morning was pretty uneventful. So I ended up getting down to Basically had to help my dad with some vehicle troubles he was having. So got off the stand and got him his vehicle taken care of, and then ended up heading back out for an evening sit. Again, not much movement there. Nothing really exciting to, nothing really exciting to report on that one. And then sat one last time on November 11th. And again, same thing. End up doing kind of just a morning sit, kind of making a last hurrah. I did want to end up spending a little bit of time with my wife before I go back to work, and then before opening day for rifle season, and then before I end up going out on my South Dakota trip. So figure I'd just do a morning sit. From there, did have some deer movement. Saw that spike again, which again was not too happy to see him again. And then did see had a couple of does that came running through. Basically, they ran all the way across the big field into the hardwoods, down into the cover. So I thought maybe there was a deer that had pushed them out of there. So I was, anticipating that. Ultimately, no deer showed up that was following them, but a 5-point that came out that I'd seen before that was messing with some deer from a couple hunts back. He came through out of the cover. Ultimately, he ended up getting on that trail from that doe and that fawn and started following their trail. Unfortunately for him, he followed it in the wrong direction. So he followed him up through the hardwoods, across the field, and then probably about 30-40 minutes later, here he comes back from the other direction. Clearly, he had lost that scent or realized that he was going in the wrong direction. He millied around out in the field a little bit, checked the cornfield, and then ultimately looped out through the field and cut back into the other side of the property there. And then that was it. I mean, that was kind of the extent of the my time at the farm for bow season, trying to hunt the rut in preparation of that. Again, my goal was to capitalize on that window that seemed like the bucks, or at least the mature bucks, or at least especially the one, seemed like I got the most intel, at least camera intel, of him being on the property. Again, ultimately, I never really got a good opportunity at him. But, again, I had a lot of good experiences. I learned a lot more about the property in that window, of, really seeing just how the rut, especially if you stick in one spot, can really change. Like usually what I end up doing is I bounce around quite a bit. I bounce between either state land or the private piece or whatnot, or even I jump around from different private pieces as well. So it's been a really interesting experience of sitting, every day on the same property and seeing how the movement changes from day to day, and how, the different weather factors play into it, for the individual deer. I mean, seeing the same deer day after day, at least for the does and the fawns, especially, that's, a pretty interesting experience to be able to see how that dynamic changes throughout the course of the week. So I guess going forward, I mean, we're looking at rifle season again, so which I'm excited about, and the fact that it is going to be nice to be able to have something that can go out and reach these deer now. So if any of the mature bucks or shooter bucks that come out, they are in much more danger of the fact that if they show their faces, then there's a good chance that they're going to get shot at. So it's not like I love bow hunting, but again, at this point in the season, I'm ready for the odds to be in my favor just a little bit more. So again, we're doing the typical going out to the farm for opening day. I'm excited the fact that my daughter is going out with us again this year. Told her the fact that we could get her another tag, and she was quite excited about the opportunity to be able to go out again and potentially harvest another buck for the year. So gonna be doing that, and then from there it's going to be out to South Dakota for my buddy for his hunt. It's gonna be pretty fun being out there and just kind of hanging out. A little bit of me is wishing I had a tag out there too, but again, at this point, I'm just going to take the chance to relax with no pressure on me to harvest a deer, and then be hopefully refreshed and ready to go when I come back, because we do a big essentially Black Friday deer drive. So I'll be ready to go for that. And then from there it'll be, hopefully with some snow at this point, and changing of the weather and the bulk of rifle season starting to wind down, be getting back out there and going after these deer again for the later part of the season. So, but I think that's going to be it for this episode. Again, a lot of experiences gained from this season. I kind of jokingly told my wife that this is the year of the close but no cigar, or the close call season, because I've had plenty of opportunities at deer. It just, for one reason or another, either the deer just didn't cooperate, or I had made some form of mistake that led to me not getting a shot opportunity. I have to I try to look at it glass half full, like the fact that, again, understand that this is deer hunting, especially when you're hunting with a bow. You're gonna fail more than you're gonna succeed. But being so close so many times, you would think at some point you'd have to get it right. But again, looking at it, that this year I have had more encounters with what I would consider shooter bucks, or bucks I'd be happy to shoot, than I have in years past. I've had more encounters with the potential to be able to harvest deer more than I have in years past, at least when it comes to bow hunting. So I'm looking at it as, I'm getting in the right spot, I'm hunting the right days. I just need to be able to work on the execution just a little bit more to be able to, seal the deal. Looking at this later season, again, things are changing about how, after rifle season's all up and done, deer are going to certainly be, starting to herd up at this point. At least the does are, and then those bucks and those deer are going to be especially, on edge from, being hunted, all the month of November, getting shot at with firearm season. So, the tactics are going to have to change a little bit. The approach is going to have to change a little bit. So again, going to be kind of changing up my my game plan for that part of the season, which I hope to be able to share that in an upcoming episode, as to kind of my approach for the late season and some things that I can hopefully help you, or some things maybe for you to think about as well. So, but again, we are still, I got to kind of remember that, for most people, we are still technically in the rut, so there's still plenty of deer out there chasing. A lot of those bigger bucks have, probably bred a doe or two by now, and are going to be out looking for those last few does as we progress through the rest of the rut. So, for most of you that are still out there hunting hard, you still have plenty of opportunity of catching a big old buck that's out cruising, looking for a doe. For me, it's going to be kind of slowing down, go out for opening day, and then just kind of take a break and come back. So, but yeah, so again, that's it for this one. And again, we'll do an update for the rifle season, hopefully, and then the next one after that will be from the South Dakota hunt. So, as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.